Thank you for your paper, James, and for the great book. It's an honour to be here as a respondent, so thank you to Chris for inviting me. Amongst other things, in getting to read through the whole manuscript of the book, I've learnt a lot about Barrow in Furness. And I was able to put some good use to this knowledge recently at a dinner party in the south of England, where I live, where someone mentioned Barrow in Furness, disparagingly, I have to add, and then quickly added to me, of course you won't have heard of the place. So I could indignantly say, I know all about Barrow in Furness, it's only the place where the great Barrovian James Crossley is from. They didn't know what to say to that, so I just left it there. But. So as James has just explained, Cults, Martyrs and Good Samaritans examines the different debates that emerged and competed in contemporary English politics. And the book analyses the ideas and assumptions and how ideas and assumptions about religion, particularly Christianity, the Bible and Islam, were part of English political discourse and were used to provide different kinds of political legitimation and inform different political imaginaries. As he's just kind of explained to us, the book engages with some of the key familiar political scenes of the last years, such as the 2016 Brexit referendum and the 2017 general election, and explains the role religion played for central political actors such as Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May. But I think one of the great strengths of the book is the way these more familiar scenes and figures are supplemented with less mainstream politics. So, for instance, in the chapter on Brexit Barrow, chapter 4, as James puts it, this chapter confronts what some of those puzzled over people outside London think. And through these interviews and discussions and analysis of social media, he probes at those stereotypes linked with the sort of town that became part of one narrative about Brexit, the kind of working class northern town. The sort of town my West Sussex dinner party would sneer at, although most likely voting Brexit themselves. But I think one of the interesting observations in this chapter, and that James also just mentioned, is how there seemed to be amongst the people spoken to very little interest in religion, Christianity and the Bible, and minimal support of Britain as a Christian country. As James writes, the closest religion got to the conversation was when I admitted what I do for a living, and then even then the response was almost always bewilderment at my job. He goes on, as a physical cultural artifact in a place like Barrow, the Bible might be received as a gift at christenings before being consigned to a life of gathering dust on the shelf. And as James comments, this all seems symptomatic of sociological and historical shifts in affiliation in the UK since the 1960s, where church attendance and affiliation, as well as the political and cultural authority of the churches declined sharply. But on this issue, I wondered about the repercussions of such decline in religious affiliation and a process of secularization, particularly in regards to language and how we recognize religiosity. One way to push back on the Barrovian indifference to religion would be to think more about the historical distancing of politics from religion and the consignment of religion to the private sphere. If secularization theses are at all correct, shouldn't we expect to find few to no references to religion in conjunction with the topic of politics amongst Barrovians and other UK citizens? Wouldn't we expect to find religion tucked into the domestic private spheres that are perceived to be non-political? And is there a difference between trying to probe how people think of religion and politics without wanting to explicitly ask about religion, and analysing conscious and strategic references to religion by politicians? And how do we make sense of that difference when understanding the connections and disconnections between religion and politics? For politicians and those attempting to construct a sort of contemporary narrative that will appeal to different publics, religion can at times usefully function as a foundation, as we've seen, a sort of narrative of origins, a mythic arc that offers continuity or gives sense to political contemporary policies and actions, such as immigration, military intervention, revolution, Syria. But to recall Talal Assad's words in his reading of Casanova's discussion of public religion, whether religious deprivatization threatens modernity or not depends on how religion becomes public. And in previous work, James has talked about the decaffeinated Bible that appears in modern politics, a Bible deprived of its malignant product in order to be made compatible with democratic and Enlightenment thought. But for non-politicians, religion and Bible might be elsewhere. They might reside in rites and rituals or function more in the affective realm, which would again mean that articulating particular beliefs or propositional statements about Bible and religiosity are less likely to occur. And I'd be interested in what would happen if so-called private spaces of morality, sensibility, practicality, domesticity, habits and behaviours were probed further, and where religion and Bible would emerge, if at all. And from there to interrogate how such private spaces relate to political decisions, identities, affiliations and commitments. I wondered also whether the Barrovian dislike and scorn for Cameron's use of the Bible signals not only a dislike of Cameron and a rather astute attitude to what is and what is not in the Bible, but also a latent sacred conception of the Bible, a kind of reverent attitude that dislikes strategic and cynical picking and choosing of verses to suit a political agenda. Are there assumptions at play here about the proper place and use of the Bible that does not only signal its relegation to the scrap heap alongside steam engines and typewriters? And is there here too an interesting point about secularization and the proper place of religion as outside the political public realm? That is also about a sort of protection of religion from the dirty hands of party politics. Further, there's a question about what is thought of as Christianity. If, as Jalanejar put it, Christianity reincarnated itself as secular, and secularization needs to be seen as at least in part a Christian process, where Christianity is assumed to be compatible with secularism, and where the paradigmatic religion is Islam, is there a sense in which people in the UK might not think of themselves and England as Christian per se, but increasingly as secular? In this sense, British identity and values are not perhaps seen as British either, but rather as secular values that could be in turn upheld as universal values, values such as tolerance, equality, freedom. Do we dizzyingly end up here back inside the enormous embrace of Christianity in some form? And in what ways might looking for religion be looking for something that is not seen as religion at all, but as secular or universal? Might the ticking off of no religion on forms be a way of identifying with a concept of the secular that is bound up with Christianity in complex ways? Clearly, the issues raised in the book about the far right, in chapter 3, Muslims, the perversion of Islam, and Christian England on the far right, are a far wider phenomena than England. And this notion that James describes of sort of Islam as the problem rather than problematic perversion of Islam is shared by far right groups and individuals across Europe and the US. Some of the most interesting questions today are, I think, how the Bible can be held up by more and less mainstream figures on the right as a guarantor of secularity and peace, and simultaneously as a salvational corpus for the Western world in a sort of crusade against Islam. So Robert Spencer, for instance, an American far-right figure who's the founder of Stop the Islamization of America, dutifully sifts through the Bible and the Quran to show the former is peaceful, the latter is violent. He does a lot of work to try to make that case. So to save the West, which apparently needs saving, we have to save Christianity, he argues. That's his central argument. Lutz Bachmann, the leader of the German far-right group Pegida, leads his followers in marches carrying an enormous cross to save the Abendland from Islam. The Bible as salvational corpus is as if imbued with talismanic properties in the formulation of violent ideologies and the execution of violent acts. But it's also hugely valued as a deadweight holding down the origins of Western civilization. The blogger Fjordman, who inspired Anders Behring Breivik's brand of far-right ideology, sees himself as a secular atheist, but holds up the Judeo-Christian civilization as superior to the Islamic world. The Bible in these far-right circles secretes nostalgia and emits puffs of rage. And an interesting paradox of the far-right is the reliance on notions of ethno-nationalism and the breakdown of this ethno-nationalism. Particularly the way the contemporary far-right operates so effectively online means that constructions of national identity bleed out of their tight confines as they traverse beyond national borders on the World Wide Web and seep into international screens and devices, from Norway to Hungary, the US, France, the Netherlands. The West is the baggy term sometimes invoked, and at other times it's Europe, but a Europe that immediately has to be distinguished from anything with even a whiff of the European Union. These categories become increasingly messy as the far-right and prominent far-right figures try to stultify a secure and solid other, which is one reason, I think, why Judaism is sometimes incorporated into the good and worthy self, while Islam is decidedly other, and at other times, Judaism is decidedly exorcised from the European Western self and joins Islam on the other side. But there is a lot of work done to keep the other, and part of this means appealing beyond local national borders, thus risking the ethno-nationalist reasoning often holding the ideology intact in the first place. And on this point, it would be interesting to see how the English far-right James discusses relates more broadly to far-right networks and figures in Europe and the US. Is it in fact possible to understand the English far-right without looking further afield to the transnational networks spreading and reinforcing overlapping anti-Muslim, often anti-Semitic, homophobic, misogynistic messages? In the mishmash and copy and paste world of online interaction, pseudo-histories of Europe, myths of the Crusades, anecdotes about Muslims, clash of civilization theses, memes about pork and burqas are all shared nationally and internationally. What does a global far-right look like? Messy, certainly, and divided by nationalist sensibilities some of the time. But what looks nationally like subcultures and relatively small percentages constitute interesting global trends in disaffection. And clearly a major issue here is masculinity and the misogyny that accompanies so much of the far right, as James discusses. Finally, I wonder how the materiality of Bibles is changing the way biblical literature is being engaged with. One of the interesting features of James's book is the attention to social media and its role in the political arena. And his discussion of the Bob Crow Brigade is particularly fascinating in this respect. What effect does social media really have on the way Bible is conceived? Clearly, there is a different reading experience at play when it comes to disseminating biblical motifs versus imagery across social media platforms, rather than an individual silently reading in the privacy of their study or a biblical text being read out loud. How are the genres of social media altering the Bible and altering engagement with the Bible? What new markets are created for Bibles to meet? and how are these markets in turn producing new versions of the Bible that are then incorporated in various political domains. When bits of Bible appear as memes, as hashtags, as images, as quotes embedded in other quotes, informal biblical canons begin to form and reform. Such informal biblical canons don't function alone, but are invariably formed with other canons, as James so effectively shows, such as Marxist canons, Labour canons, or as we might find on the internet, popular wisdom canons, cute kittens canons. Following Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari for a very brief moment, I think partly what is necessary is not to keep asking what a text means, such as what does a biblical text mean in this particular context, and instead ask what a biblical text or element functions with. In connection with what other things does it transmit intensities? With what other bodies does it converge? The Bible is not an inside with meanings encased by thick leather skin, but a set of parts forming relations, like elements coming together to form a machine, a sort of biblical machine. What does a Bible need to plug into to work? And which biblical machine are we talking about? The historical critical Bible is, it seems to me, a rather different machine to the art history Bible or the Southern Baptist Convention Bible. Doing more work to illuminate how such Bibles and how such informal biblical canons resonate with particular audiences and become effective and affective will undoubtedly help to shed light on the ongoing influence of the multiplicity that is the Bible. Cults, Martyrs and Good Samaritans is an important contribution to that work. Thank you.